Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to finish our reading of Carrie's War by Nina Bodden by reading chapter 15. So your homework over the weekend had been to read chapters 12, 13, and 14. We've had some really good discussions in our online video conferences about your answers to the questions that I had asked you. So we know that at the end of chapter 14, Nick and Carrie are on the train going back to be reunited with their mother. And Carrie is inconsolable. She's crying and crying and crying. And as a lot of you pointed out in our novel study discussion group online, this is because as they're leaving, she sees that Druid's Bottom is on fire. And of course, because she believes Hepzibah's story about the cursed skull, and she knows that she took the skull and threw it into the horse pond, she believes that she cursed the house and she's actually responsible for it burning down. So you can imagine, I think, the horrible guilt that Carrie is feeling responsible for this terrible, terrible thing that's happened to Druid's Bottom, because as far as she knows, Hepzibah is still there, Mr. Johnny is still there, Albert's sandwich is still there. So she feels like she's responsible for something absolutely horrific. Why does she do this? Why does she throw the skull in the horse pond? Well, again, in many of our conversations, a lot of you have pointed out that she was really upset and angry with Mr. Evans. She believed that Hepzibah and Mr. Johnny would be sent away from Druid's Bottom, and she did not want Mr. Evans to have this peaceful time at Druid's Bottom. However, I think that what happened with Druid's Bottom burning down goes much, much further than what Carrie would have hoped for when she had this moment where she acted out, where her anger caused her to act out. I'm sure that this is not what she would have wanted to have happen. And I think that we could relate to that. I think sometimes if we're angry or we're upset and we act out without really thinking about what we're doing, it can have really serious consequences that we never intended to have happen. And I think that this is what's happened with Carrie. Something we need to consider as readers is, do we believe the curse? Do we think that Druid's Bottom has burnt down because Carrie threw the skull in the horse pond, or do we think that something else has happened here? Well, let's read chapter 15 and we'll see if we find out. So chapter 15 begins with, again, the pictures are always very important. I imagine that this is a picture of the house at Druid's Bottom. So that picture could indicate that we're going to learn what happened. And the beginning line, even 30 years later, when she was quite old enough to know it wasn't her fault, that a house didn't burn down because a girl threw a skull into a horse pond, she still cried in much the same way when she thought of it. So just as the novel began in the present day with an adult Carrie bringing her 3 children back to this place from her past, we've now, on our final chapter, gone back into the present moment. So opening chapter, present moment, then we go back in time 30 years to learn Carrie's story, and to conclude the story, the author has brought us back to the present day. So we're back with adult Carrie and her 3 children. Evidently, she still has this terrible feeling of guilt. Even though as an adult she may not feel that it's her responsibility, that it wasn't really a cursed skull, it wasn't her fault that the place burned down, she still carries this terrible feeling with her. Okay, we'll continue. Not in front of the children, but later, when they had all gone to sleep. Oh, sorry, I'll start again. Even 30 years later, when she was quite old enough to know it wasn't her fault that a house didn't burn down because a girl threw a skull into a horse pond, she still cried in much the same way when she thought of it. Not in front of the children, but later, when they had all gone to bed and to sleep. Only the oldest boy stayed awake, and he heard her, crying softly in the next room, on, like a waterfall. Really beautiful simile there. In the morning, he told the others they were not to disturb her. She was tired, he said. They would go for a walk before breakfast and let her sleep as long as she needed. He knew where he was going. He led them at a smart pace along the path where the railway had been, and though they grumbled about the branches scratching their legs, his sister and his brothers followed him. But when they came to the grove, they stopped and hung back. He said, "You don't have to come. None of you." That made them want to, of course. And they were not really the sort of children who were easily frightened. Once they had set their feet on the path, they tumbled down, bold and bouncy as puppies. Again, sorry, I'm pausing because we have another simile here. Nina Bodden, uses them often. Once they had set their feet on the path, they tumbled down, bold and bouncy as puppies. So she's used the word "as" to compare the younger children and some puppies. So we get this really great picture in our minds of the children going down the hill. Carrie's daughter said, "What were they scared of, her and Uncle Nick? Just a few silly old trees." But when they got to the bottom of the grove, they were scared a little. The ruined house looked so dead in the sunlight, with its blackened walls and boarded-up windows. There was the yard and the horse pond, and the dead house beyond them. "Come on," the oldest boy said. "We can't just go back. Might as well have a proper look while we're here." But even he went forward slowly. The smallest one clung to him. Were they really all burned up? To a cinder? She thought so. Why didn't she ask someone? Scared to find out, I suppose. Scaredy cat. She's a scaredy cat. You'd be too, I expect, if you had done what she did, the oldest boy said, or thought you had. Let me see, the stables must be round at the side. They turned the corner of the house and saw what looked like an outbuilding, only rather a smart one, painted white and with a tub of nasturtiums outside the open front door. Now, nasturtiums is a new word for me, but I'm going to use the context of what's happening to try to piece together what that word means. So they're at an outbuilding, which is just, we can imagine a smaller house on the same property that may be used for storage or something. If there's a tub of nasturtiums, I'm imagining it's some sort of a flower, because we would plant flowers in a big bucket or a tub sometimes outside of a house. So I'll look it up in the dictionary afterwards, but I think that's what they are. Carrie's daughter wrinkled her nose. Bacon cooking? Shh. The oldest boy seized the younger two and dragged them back out of sight. If someone's living there, we've no business to go rootling around. Trespassing. I didn't see any notice to stop us, Carrie's daughter said. She peered round the corner of the house, then flapped her hands behind her. Hang on. They waited. When she turned round, her cheeks were fat as balloons, fit to burst. She blew out through her lips and pretended to fan herself. She said, "How old was Hepzibah?" "I don't know. Mom didn't say." "She didn't say nothing about people's ages, didn't she?" "Don't know. Can't remember." Now, sorry, I'm going to pause here. There's a lot of really short little sentences right in a row here, and the author has done this on purpose. When an author is trying to create tension, and when you're trying to create tension in your writing, if you use short little sentences, it picks the pace up of the writing or the dialogue, and we get this sort of feeling of tension as a reader because everything is moving sort of in these short little bursts. Okay, so it's a good tip to remember for your writing. If you want to create tension, you want to make a reader really wonder what's going to happen next, short little sentences can help with that. "I don't know, can't remember." "What are you whispering for?" the oldest boy said. He looked himself and saw a tall old woman coming towards them. No, not towards them. She didn't know they were there. Towards a gate that led to a field tucked away under the mountain. A flash of white feathers in the field, and the old woman was carrying a bucket. Hepzibah! Hepzibah going to feed her chickens. Even if it isn't, he thought, she can't bite me. Now we can think about this as readers. Could it be Hepzibah? This is 30 years ago. If Hepzibah was an adult, say she was 30 years old 30 years ago, she'd be 60 now. Absolutely possible. If she was 40, she'd be 70 now. Absolutely possible. So let's read and find out. He stepped out of cover and walked up to her. She had gray eyes and white hair. He said, speaking fast to get it over with, but politely, "Are you Miss Hepzibah Green? If you are, my mother remembers you." She stared at him. stared and stared, and her gray eyes seemed to grow larger and brighter. At last she said, "Carrie? Carrie's boy?" He nodded, and her eyes shone brilliant as diamonds. Her face cracked in 1,000 lines when she smiled. Now, this again, we've got another simile. Her eyes bright as diamonds gives us this really beautiful picture. And her face cracked in 1,000 lines when she smiled. Well, here we have hyperbole and exaggeration to, again, create a picture in somebody's mind. So some more figurative or poetic devices. Her face cracked in 1,000 lines when she smiled. And the others? Yes, gracious heavens. She looked at them all, one by one, then again at the oldest boy. You look like your mother. They don't, but you do. Green eyes, he said. It's having green eyes. Not only that, she looked at him, smiling, and he thought she was beautiful, even though she was old and had a stiff curly whisker or two on her chin. The little ones would giggle at that if they'd noticed, and if they giggled, she'd know what about, he was sure. She was sharp. He thought, I'd better warn them. She said, "What am I thinking about? You'll be wanting your breakfast, and here I am standing here as if eggs cooked themselves. White ones or brown ones, or speckledy." Well, that's a hard word to say. I would say speckly, but she said speckledy. "Oh, we don't want," he began, but she was leading the way, very tall, very thin, very old, skinny old legs, stiff as stilts. They went in through the white painted door, down a passage into a kitchen. It had been part of a barn, perhaps, because there was a high ceiling and beams, but it was cozy and bright, with a wood fire in the hearth and the sun streaming in. Hepzibah said, "Look who's here, Mr. Johnny. Carrie's children." He sat in a chair in the sun by the window, a tiny bald man, like an elderly goblin. He blinked at them sleepily. "Say hello to Carrie's children," Hepzibah said. He smiled shyly, ducking his head. "Hi-yo, hi-yo. How you?" So we can see that Mr. Johnny has learned to speak a little bit better. So maybe we'll find out what's happened to Hepzibah and Mr. Johnny, but isn't it lovely to see them still living there? We'll find out why. "He can speak," Carrie's daughter said. "He can speak properly." Her face swelled with rage at the thought of the lies her mother had told. "Not when Carrie was here he couldn't," Hepzibah said. "After the war, when Albert was grown, he had a friend of his, a speech therapist, come down from London. Mr. Johnny will never talk like the rest of us, but it's more company for me having him answer, and it's better for him. He doesn't feel so cut off. Your mother tell you about Albert?" They nodded. "Albert's sandwich. What a name!" Hepzibah stood with her eyes fixed on a distance, remembering. "Oh, they were a pair, him and your mother. Talk of opposites. Mr. Head and Miss Hart, I used to call them, and both of them stubborn as mules when their minds were fixed. She said she'd write first," he said, and nothing would budge him. "Mr. Cocksure, he seemed sometimes, but he was shy underneath. He thought she couldn't be bothered once she'd gone away." "She thought he was dead. That's why she never wrote," the oldest boy said. "She thought you were all dead in the fire." How absurd, he thought. Did she really think that? But how did she know about the old fire? She saw it from the train. Hepzibah looked at him. Witch's eyes, the oldest boy thought. But that was ridiculous. He said she threw the skull in the horse pond. She thought she'd started the fire. Doing that, it sounds silly now. Hepzibah said, "Oh, poor little Carrie." She looked at him. "She believed my old tales. You wouldn't, would you?" "No, I don't think so." But her bright eyes seemed to be seeing more than eyes usually did, seeing straight into him, and it made him less certain. He said, "I don't know." She said, "The insurance people said it was Mr. Johnny playing with matches. All I know is it was him that woke us up. Saved our lives, probably. Nothing else, though. Albert got a few books out of the library, burned his hands and his eyebrows off. He looked a real scarecrow." "Was all the house burned?" "Gutted inside. The floors and the staircase. We moved into the barn. Camped out to begin with. Then the lawyers did up the outbuildings and said we could stay on as caretakers. Keep an eye on what was left of the place. What happened to Mr. Evans? Carrie's daughter said. It all belonged to him, didn't it? He died, poor man, not long after the fire. Heart, the doctors said, but it was more grief and loneliness. Missed his sister. She'd left him to marry an American soldier. Auntie Lou. That's what Carrie and Nick used to call her. Mrs. Cass Harper, that's her name now. She went to live in North Carolina after the war. North Carolina is one of the states in the United States, so she went home with the American soldier. We heard nothing from her for years till last summer, when her son came down to have a look at the place. Tall young man with a drawly voice. Hard to make head or tail of what he said, really. Shrewgullum, Mr. Johnny said, looking excited. That's right, brought Mr. Johnny some chewing gum, and he got it stuck to his dentures. Albert came to meet Mr. Harper and fixed up to buy the place. He says he wants to rebuild and live here one day, but I think he was thinking more of Mr. Johnny and me. You'll be safe now, he said, when the papers were signed. No one can turn you out, ever. And we're grateful, of course, though he won't hear of gratitude. He says we're all the family he's got, since his own parents died when he was a little lad, and he's got no one else, never married. Oh, he's been like a son to us, Albert has. Comes down at least once a month, due this weekend, as a matter of fact. I wonder if Carrie and Albert would have a chance to meet up if he's coming back for the weekend. Could be a possibility. All the time she was talking, she was setting the table with egg cups and mugs, and cutting bread and butter. Eggs were boiling on the stove. She lifted them out and said, "Come on now, you must be hungry." The eggs were beautiful, firm whites and dark runny yolks, and the butter, thickly spread on crisp bread, was like no butter they had ever tasted, smooth, but leaving a grainy salt tang behind on the tongue. We do this often in our writing, by the way. We incorporate the five senses to help give our reader a picture. And here Nina Bodden has incorporated not just what the breakfast looks like, but how it tastes. So that gives us a vivid image. Was Albert an orphan then? Carrie's daughter asked. She didn't say. Who's she? The cat's mother? No, mine, she said, grinning at Hepzibah. Little Carrie, Hepzibah said in her soft, remembering voice, and this made the children laugh. She's ever so tall for a woman, the oldest boy said. Our dad used to call her a beanpole. He felt Hepzibah's eyes on him and buried his face in his mug. He had said used to. Would Hepzibah start poking and prying? Most people did, and he hated it. Hated having to explain that his father was dead. But Hepzibah wasn't most people, he realized suddenly. She hadn't once asked any of the ordinary questions. Where is your mother? What are you doing here by yourselves? Does she know where you are? Hepzibah said thoughtfully, It'll be good to see little Carrie. She may have grown taller, but she's the sort doesn't change other ways. Nor your Uncle Nick, neither. How is he now? Fat, the little ones said, and looked at each other and giggled. Well, he always had an eye for his stomach. Mr. Johnny, do you remember, Nick? How that boy used to eat. Mr. Johnny looked blank. It's a long time for him to remember a name, Hepzibah said, though he'd know Nick at once if he saw him. He doesn't forget those he loves. He'll know Carrie when she comes. Does she still like her eggs boiled 5 minutes? The children sat quiet. Then the oldest boy said, She won't come, Hepzibah. I mean, she'll come when we go back and fetch her, but she's not coming now. She's too afraid. Had always been afraid, he thought, more afraid than most mothers, not stopping them doing things. She wasn't silly like that, but you would look at her sometimes and see the fear holding her still, especially when they were happy, as if she were afraid of a happy time stopping. He thought perhaps because this happy time had come to an end all those years ago, and she blamed herself for it. So the eldest son is now thinking he understands his mother a little bit better, why she behaves the way that she does sometimes, because what happened at Druid's Bottom has really impacted her. Hepzibah was smiling at him as if she knew what he was thinking, as if she understood everything. But she couldn't understand. She was just a clever old woman who had persuaded Carrie to believe her old tales. Hepzibah had taken his mother in with her spooky nonsense, the oldest boy thought, and felt, all at once, rather indignant. He's maybe blaming Hepzibah a little bit. If he's feeling indignant, he's feeling sort of upset about this and maybe wondering if Hepzibah should maybe not have told those stories. But these are things that I'm sure that Hepzibah had the best of intentions for doing. And I think Carrie's eldest boy is just looking at it from his mother's point of view, or maybe a protective point of view, that he wishes his mother hadn't felt so badly and so guilty for all that time. Hepzibah turned to the stove and put a brown egg in the simmering water. "That'll be timed about right," she said. "You go and meet her. Tell her all is well and her egg's on the boil and Hepzibah's waiting. Run along quickly. She'll be halfway down the mountain by now." Her voice had a clear command in it, and the children stood up and went meekly out of the kitchen, past the old ruined house, past the horse pond. As they crossed the yard, the oldest boy stopped being indignant with Hepzibah and felt sorry instead, because she was so foolishly sure and was going to be disappointed. She thought she knew their mother was coming, and she couldn't possibly know. She wasn't a witch, just an old woman who was quite good at guessing, but had guessed wrong this time. "There's no point in hanging about," he said. "We'll wait a minute to please Hepzibah, and then we'll go back and finish our breakfast. I dare say one of us can eat an extra egg." But the others were younger than he was, and so still believing, still trusting. They looked at him, then at each other, and laughed, and ran ahead to meet their mother coming through the Druid's Grove. The end. So, we're left with a little bit of uncertainty at the end of this novel, and this is something I would like you to consider for your writing assignment that I have given you to do today. I want you to consider the following question. Are you happy with this ending? Are you happy that some things were left uncertain, or would you rather have known? Did Carrie go and meet Hepzibah? Do you think she would have gone to meet Hepzibah? If she's made it through the grove, she's made it through the scariest part, her children are there. Will she continue all the way into the house, or will she turn around and go back to the car? Would you rather the author had told you which one of those choices that she made, or are you happy just having it as it is? I really want you to consider the ending of this book, how it makes you feel. And the assignment that I've given you is on the Shape of the Day email that I sent this morning. I would like you to consider either an alternate ending, a different ending, you rewrite the last chapter, or an additional chapter. So you add the next chapter on, you finish off and clear up that uncertainty. You tell me, you write a chapter, what happens next. When you do your writing, I'd really like you to use the same style as the author. Try to make your voice sound like the author's voice has so far. And please make your ending consistent with the story. So the example I gave this morning, Carrie jumping into a UFO and flying out into outer space, is not consistent with the story. It's not realistic, and it wouldn't make sense. So when you are writing your ending, I would really like you to focus on making it consistent, making it realistic, making it sound like it's Nina Bodden who has continued to write. Okay, so once again, you either write an alternative ending, you change it, or you write an additional ending. Maybe you want to discuss what does happen in the immediate future. Does Carrie go into Hepzibah's house? And then what happens? Does she stick around for the weekend and meet up with Albert Sandwich? What happens? Or you could also write further into the future, Carrie's life 10 years, 5 years after. What's become of her? How is her relationship with Hepzibah and Mr. Johnny and Albert? What's happening with her eldest children? Or all of her children, for that matter. Okay, so I really hope that you've enjoyed the book. I think it's a great adventure. You've done a lot of really good work and had to consider some really challenging questions. So I hope that you have fun with this last assignment, where you are going to write me either an alternative or additional ending to what I've just read with you now. I hope that you have a great day, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you soon on our Zoom calls. Okay, have a great day. Bye.